Welcome to a virtual Chatham House roundtable to discuss societal resilience in the face of Russian aggression. My name is Orisa Lutsevich and I am tuning in from London. I would like to welcome all our audiences from Brussels, from Kyiv, from Washington, from other European capitals. We are on the record today, so we will be recording both the video of our conversation, but also questions. So ladies and gentlemen, if you join our conversation, you will be on video. This event will be bilingual. It will be English and Ukrainian. If you need interpretation from Russian, actually, one of the speakers will speak Russian into English, please use the interpretation function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So my name is Orisa Lutsevich and I am the head of Ukraine Forum at Chatham House in London. And we have been working very closely following developments in Ukraine prior to the armed conflict with Russia and annexation on Crimea, and especially after the armed conflict in Donbas and the reforms that Ukraine started. We are thinking about what is happening right now in Ukraine. And of course, the first thing that comes to mind is the war in Donbas. It's 427 kilometers of the contact line that divides Donbas from the rest of Ukraine. But there's actually quite long border. I was thinking that it equals the border of England with Wales and Scotland combined. So when you think about the territorial impact of this conflict, it's quite dramatic. But it goes much beyond just the security threat for people living within the contact line. It affects the whole of society. So with me today to discuss how Ukrainian society is coping with the consequences of the conflict, with continued Russian aggressions throughout the rest of Ukraine, I have excellent panel today. I'm joined by, and I will introduce them in the order that we will speak, by my colleague Mathieu Boulek, who is a research fellow at Russia and Eurasia program at Chatham House, the co-author of our new resilience study. I'm really pleased that the Deputy Minister of Interior of Ukraine, Anton Herashchenko from Kyiv, found some time to share his views about Ukraine's resilience. I also have a pleasure to introduce Ambassador Baiba Braza, who is joining us from NATO headquarters. She is Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy. Welcome, Ambassador. And last but not least, from Helsinki, we have Jukka Savolainen, Director of Community of Interest of Vulnerabilities and Resilience from the European Center of Excellence for Countering Hybrid Threats. It's a center set up in 2017, a quite new organization, but it unites European countries in the effort to design systems that protect societies from different threats. So I will start by giving just a brief overview of our take at Chatham House on resilience and why we are focusing on it. And then we'll go to the speakers. So I would like to start with presenting some of the findings of our study on vulnerabilities. And as I said, Ukraine faces this war of attrition by Russian Federation that uses a variety of tools. And the first response and the first tool of defense for any kind of resilience is, of course, awareness of vulnerabilities. And on this chart, you could see, as based on expert interviews, that conflict and security, corruption and political sphere are viewed as one of the top sectors where Russia uses its influence in a way to derail Ukraine's integration with the West, to undermine its efforts in reforms, and in a way to make Ukrainians disbelieve in its nation-building project. It's interesting that before our event today, we wanted to refresh this study, and we asked 23 experts, how do they evaluate now Russia's vulnerabilities? And you could see that armed conflict and media environment became even more prominent. This is in view of course, upcoming local elections and Russia's vicious use of disinformation to spread false information about current government, about Ukraine's leadership, and about the role of the West in particular, such as IMF and NATO. So all of this research was done thanks to support from the National Endowment for Democracy. And we are really pleased that there is now clear understanding that democracy needs a very resilient society. And it's one of the things where we hope that some of these features of resilient system we will be able to embed in Ukrainian governance and in society. And the question is really, some of these features, how do we as organizations build a house that withstands all of these threats? In Ukraine, you do have a society where we believe has this resilience capital, that regardless of weak institutions, and we all know it's Ukraine's curse, Ukrainians are accustomed to living to instability, and they have past resilience of traumas, just to mention Chernobyl, what it took to survive as a society. But also Ukrainians are determined to defend their country. I mean, there was a recent poll dedicated to Ukraine's Defenders Day, where 59% said they would be ready with arms to defend Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. There is a growing sense of patriotism and belonging to Ukraine. 73%, first of all, identify themselves as Ukrainian citizens. And there's also quite strong mobilization of civil society. I am mentioning these as societal resilience blogs because we are talking about security threats, not about natural disasters, where in a way infrastructure, logistics, bridges are prime importance. But here we are talking about this corrosive influence on the society that I've mentioned before. But what is interesting, again, coming back to the poll that we've done recently before this event, when we asked experts, do they believe that Zelensky's policies are making Ukraine more vulnerable or more resilient to Russian threat? This is a small number of experts, but it's people who know Ukraine quite well. So 73%, unfortunately, said that they believe that Zelensky's policy make Ukraine more vulnerable. And we can have a discussion, and I'm sure the deputy minister will probably reflect on this number. But this mostly is to do with state policies and decreasing trust in democratic institutions, very poor response to disinformation and protection of Ukrainian information space, and most prominently, I guess, how they view Zelensky dealing with conflict. And here I'll give a floor to Mathieu to explain how conflict impacts the rest of Ukraine.
Thank you very much, Orysia, and I'll be continuing to share my screen to show you the rest of the PowerPoint presentation today. So what we did in this sort of updated study on resilience is specifically look at how Russia's drivers of negative influence are influencing society in general and society at large in Ukraine, and what is in a way the influence of the armed conflict on societal cohesion and societal polarization. And we have identified a few risks. The first one is basically the risk of societal polarization, specifically across different regions in Ukraine now, with links to the decentralization, and social polarization emerging between citizens who express strong patriotic sentiment on the one hand, and those who actually want to sort of compromise along the line laid down by the Kremlin. And this is where tension starts to grow. The support for reintegration, for instance, is lower, we figured out, in the oblasts with higher numbers of participants in the war compared to those who haven't actually experienced the war firsthand, who've only been witnesses of the war through what they could have seen in the media or what their families could have told them. So in a way, you also have a regional divide across the territory of Ukraine concerning reintegration, which is also increasing polarization. And this is amplified also by this sort of conflict fatigue that is impacting mentality. 6 years onwards after the war, there is definitely a sort of fatigue growing for citizens in Ukraine concerning the place and the cost of the conflict on mentalities, but also on how history is changed for the Ukrainian state. The second point of dissension and how the conflict influences society is the ongoing humanitarian crisis. Something that should not be forgotten is that out of the 5.2 million people affected by the war in Donbas, around 3.5 million are dependent on humanitarian assistance and are still dependent on humanitarian assistance today. Living conditions in the line of contact are deteriorating and have been deteriorating ever since the start of the conflict, with a lot of issues remaining concerning access to medical care, access to vital foodstuff and water, which also means that the prices for basic commodities and essential goods have been increasing to very unsustainable levels since the start of the conflict. And all of this is linked mostly to very poor infrastructure, which have been impacted by military operation, and a lot of strain on road and rail infrastructure to connect people and to connect communities and assistance and humanitarian aid across the line of contact and throughout. The third risk caused by the armed conflict to Ukrainian society is the presence of what we could call the militarization of occupied Donbas. The persistence of landmines, for instance, and other explosive remnants of war that are scattered on both lines of the line of contact, which basically threaten wider human security and once again hinder the reconstruction of basic infrastructure in Donbas and throughout the line of contact. There's also a spillover of small firearms and explosive devices from the conflict area to the rest of Ukraine, which is a very serious cause of concern because the number of violent and serious crimes committed with the use of firearms has substantially increased in the territory of Ukraine since the start of the war, which is also increasing the level of violence in Ukrainian society. For instance, the prevalence of an increase in domestic abuse or gender-based violence perpetrated by certain fringes of society, but more specifically linked to veterans, for instance, and the veteran community. And it's also feeding a form of reverence for military values across society, which could have negative political consequences in the long term. And the final, one of the final problems, is still the presence, of course, of Ukrainians remaining trapped inside the non-governmental controlled areas of Donbas, of occupied Donbas, which have experienced for the past few years a soft absorption conducted by the Kremlin inside the NGCA, the non-governmental controlled areas, which seriously impedes the prospect for the reintegration of the region into Ukraine. There is a growing sense of alienation of the population from the so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic to the rest of Ukraine, which means that it is really hard in a way for these people to feel that they can be reappropriated back inside the territory, or that they sort of share a common destiny with mainland Ukraine or free Ukraine. So there's a lot of prerequisites that are needed. We'll go through them later to try to reintegrate these territories back to Donbas. But it's not just the reintegration of the territories we're talking about here. It's very much a reintegration of the inhabitants. In a way, Ukrainians still living in the NGCA need to feel wanted back inside mainland Ukraine, which calls for a genuine human dimension to the conflict and a genuine people-based approach to the conflict that still needs to be properly defined today. The last point of discontent is the growing presence of veterans as a sort of social bubble inside of Ukraine, specifically because the number of disenfranchised veterans is growing in Ukrainian society since the onset of the war. We're talking today about 360,000 veterans of war, or registered as such, in the territory of Ukraine today, which have a very different view from the rest of society because they have been direct and active participants, not just to the conflict, but to the war itself and to the war operations. And they are very generally very entrenched positions concerning settlement of the conflict. There's a very worrying prevalence of substance abuse, notably drugs and alcohol, domestic abuse, and war-induced psychological disorders among veterans and demobilized soldiers. All these issues need to be more thoroughly and more comprehensively addressed by the Ukrainian government as of today. And in a way, these disenfranchised veterans are an easy target for the recruitment to various criminal or right-wing paramilitary groups still existing in Ukraine today. What we want to look at afterwards is what is Kiev's homework in a way to increase resilience? What must be done today to make sure that Ukraine becomes a more resilient state, and how to measure how much more resilient Ukraine has become under President Zelenskyy. One of the first steps is basically to build better institutions. This is something that the reforms since the end of the war have been focusing on, but it needs to go in a sort of order. This goes clearly hand in hand with justice sector reform, for instance. Courts and judges must go first, corruption must be tackled second, in a way. There needs to be a very proper order to how to build stronger and more resilient institutions. The second logic is cognitive resilience, the need to create future active citizens, smart citizens in a way, who know how to consume information in the best way possible. Resilience starts at home, and it mostly starts with education sector reform to make sure that in the information sphere, people have the right and proper tools to fight against propaganda, whether it is Russian-based propaganda or otherwise. The third point is to increase the development of social cohesion. In the report, we acknowledge for the creation of an index of social cohesion for each region across all the issues that Ukraine is facing, and to try to train government officials to use and develop better regional policies aimed at increasing Ukrainian resilience. These could address, for instance, IDPs and veterans through safer and more inclusive reintegration, notably psychological rehabilitation of veterans and IDPs, but also increasing the quality and the quantity of civic engagement. Because for now, a lot of Ukrainians and Ukrainian citizens do not feel empowered to increase the level of standing, the level of activism in civil society. And this is especially important in the context of decentralization, because a lot of citizens feel disempowered or disconnected or feel they don't have enough agency over what's happening in the local decision-making process. So in a way, a lot needs to be done to increase the quality and quantity of civic engagement in Ukraine, but also resolve problems around internal mobility, improving cohesion through mobility and revamping infrastructure to make sure that citizens have the ability to move across territories and regions, especially in the context of decentralization once again. And then a final point is to promote a national dialogue and a shared vision for Donbas and Crimea. President Zelenskyy has for the first time demonstrated a sort of genuine willingness to achieve peace and to achieve a human-centric approach to managing the conflict. So in a way, Ukraine has made a choice. It is, once again, the president for peace and a Ukraine for peace. The new Ukrainian leadership, however, has very limited capacity to apply a resilience-based approach to the conflict, because so much still depends on the Minsk discussions and so much is still hanging on Russia's willingness to do anything about the conflict. But it doesn't mean that there's not a lot of homework that Ukraine can do right now to try to strengthen national unity. For instance, being more inclusive towards the NGCA populations, and I'm talking about the citizens, not the authorities, to try to include them in the reintegration process, try to address their concerns, basically sit down with people across Ukrainian region and across the NGCA to try to reintegrate people, mentalities, concerns, not just territories. And there's also been a lot of calls concerning the development of transitional justice, for instance, in Ukraine today. So in a way, the government should feel empowered to facilitate a nationwide conversation between policymakers, community-based organizations in civil society, companies from small and medium-sized companies, the media, regional elite and beyond, in a way to try to discuss what are the preconditions of peace, what are the terms to potential compromises if there needs to be compromises, and what does it mean to safely and securely reintegrate Donbas to mainland Ukraine. In a way, if the voices of Ukrainians are not heard, even the best peace plan will fall apart. So there needs to be, in a way, a safe space for reintegration and a safe space to discuss this. It's okay to talk about the war. It's okay to talk about reintegration. So people need to feel the need to talk about these things and not just hush it up and not talk about it. So I will stop there and I will leave my colleague continue with their presentations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mathieu. So clearly you could see that Anton Yurievich in Kiev has a full plate just on the side of the Ministry of Interior. But of course, there's a lot of Ukrainian agencies involved in trying to design both responses immediately on the front line, but also in the mainland Ukraine. So I would like now to invite Mr. Herashchenko to share his views, how he sees the threats, where he sees Ukraine is right now, and what are the policies in Kiev that help shield Ukraine, if there are such, from Russian negative influence. Антон Юрійович, прошу, вам слово.
Доброго дня. Мене звуть Антон Геращенко, я є заступником міністра внутрішніх справ Арсена Авакова. Також я був депутатом Верховної Ради в попередньої каденції, займався питаннями реформи правоохоронної системи нашої держави. Щодо взагалі ситуації з продовженням російської агресії, яка вже триває 6,5 років, то я скажу ті речі, які не дуже популярні в європейських країнах. Фактично Україна була в 2014 році брошена на призволяще західними союзниками, які всупереч положенням Будапештського меморандуму, який гарантував безпеку України від будь-якого нападу взамін на повернення на віддачу України Російської Федерації третього по розміру у світі ядерного потенціалу, ми осталися один на один з Російською Федерацією. До 1995 року у нас було 1740 ядерних боєзарядів. Ми їх віддали в обмін на гарантії від Великої Британії, в обмін на гарантії від Сполучених Штатів, Франції, але ці гарантії були лише папірцями на бумагі. Тому зараз Україна продовжує ставатися сам на сам з величезною агресією з боку Російської Федерації. 10% нашої території окуповані ворогом. У протистоянні з Росією загинуло близько 14 тисяч наших військових та цивільних осіб, це і жінки, і діти. Фактично вперше з 1945 року, це закінчення Другої світової війни, на території Європи було факт агресії проти іншої незалежної держави і захоплена інша територія. Щодо тих заходів, які Україна створює для того, щоб протистояти Російської Федерації, можу сказати як громадянин, що вважаю, що цих заходів недостатньо. Україна продовжує залишатися розірваною країною. У нас є протистояння по лінії Захід і Схід, протистояння, які підігріються Російською Федерацією. Це протипоставлення російськомовного населення України, україномовному населенню України. Це протистояння по лінії церкви Московського патріархату і Незалежної Української православної церкви. Це протистояння по питанням культури, це протистояння по російській пропаганді. На жаль, за нашими оцінками, до 30% українських громадян продовжують дивитися російські телеканали, які в нас не показують в кабельних мережах, в ефірі, але дивляться їх через інтернет, дивляться їх через супутник і отримують іноземну пропаганду. Ми заборонили в себе в Україні з 2016 року російські соціальні мережі, такі як Однокласники, ВКонтакті, але, на жаль, є багато людей, які все ж таки знаходять можливості долучатися до них. На жаль, за ці 6,5 роки незалежності ми не отримали достатньо військової підтримки від Заходу. Нам не поставляють сучасні системи протиповітряної оборони. Фактично ті системи протиповітряної оборони, які є в нас, їм по 30, 35, 40 років. Жодна західна країна не поставляє нам будь-яких сучасних систем озброєння. Ті, що нам передали там декілька сотень американських протитанкових комплексів «Джевелін», ну це просто капля в морі, це більше така, знаєте, показуха, чим реальна підтримка. Тому можу сказати, що в цілому ми з Російською Федерацією знаходимося сам на сам. Що не зроблено в Україні для того, щоб протистояти російській агресії? Я згоден з попереднім виступаючим в тому, що не залучене громадське суспільство було президентом Порошенка до опору російської агресії. Я особисто зустрічався з Петром Порошенка ще в 2016 році і пропонував йому прийняти законодавство на кшталт швейцарського, або естонського, або фінського, яке б залучало сотні тисяч українців, ветеранів війн, до захисту України в рамках територіальної оборони. Петро Порошенко на це не пішов. І дуже радіє той факт, що президент Зеленський після свого візиту у Литву та Естонію в грудні минулого року він наказав підготувати такий законопроект. Він зараз знаходиться вже на виході, і ми сподіваємося, що в 2021 році в Україні буде прийнятий закон про територіальну оборону на кшталт швейцарського, фінського, естонського. Ми зможемо залучати сотні тисяч українців до того, щоб вони тренувалися і могли приймати участь в територіальній обороні. Нам нужна підтримка в тому, щоб Захід продавав нам сучасні системи озброєння. Наприклад, війна, яка зараз веде Азербайджан з Арменією, показує ефективність використання безпілотних апаратів летальних. І це апарати турецького виробництва Байрактар. Україна має такі апарати з Турції, але жодна європейська країна або Сполучені Штати відмовляються продавати нам сучасні системи озброєння, в тому числі високоточні ракети, високоточні снаряди. І це дуже жаль. Я прошу всіх експертів, які слухають нас, закликати свої уряди для того, щоб ви не тільки допомагали нам на словах через, як то кажуть, велике розуміння наших проблем, а через те, щоб було стимули на дозвіл експорту до України сучасного західного озброєння. Це те, що нам потрібно. Щодо проблем, які в нашій країні є ще. Так, це дійсно високий рівень корупції, чим користується Російська Федерація. Це п'ята колона, яка працює в Україні, тому що в нас є дуже багато людей, які можуть вішати в себе в кабінеті українські флаги, а думати про Росію, мати дуже великі контакти з Російською Федерацією. Ні для кого не є секретом, що одним із керівників другої по розмірам фракції Верховній Раді опозиційної платформа «За життя» є особистий кум Володимира Путіна Віктор Медведчук, який контролює безпосередньо 3 новинних телевізійних канали, який контролює і намагається побудувати альтернативну систему влади в Україні. І він користується тим, що в нас в Україні є велика корупція в правоохоронних органах, які не можуть розслідувати дуже серйозні справи проти топ-олігархів нашої країни. Як ми тут шуткуємо в Україні, що тільки ФБР може розслідувати справи проти наших олігархів, таких як Лазаренко, там Фірташ і таке інше. Наші правоохоронні органи, прокуратура, на жаль, не здатні на такого роду справи. Але зрозуміло, що тільки український народ може через чесні демократичні вибори обирати себе керівництво, парламент, який буде приймати рішення, які будуть направлені на зміни в нашій країні. Хочу нагадати також, що Велика Британія або Сполучені Штати Америки, вони мають сотні років демократичного радювання. Ми лише 29-й рік маємо демократію в Україні і можемо робити демократичний вибір. У нас є проблема з дуже низькою якістю державного апарату і дуже частою зміняємостю влади. Наприклад, сьогоднішній уряд Дениса Шмигаля – це вже 20-й уряд за 29 років. Чи може ефективно працювати держава, в якій кожні 1,5 роки міняється уряд? І те, що в нас є успіхи певні в Міністерстві внутрішніх справ, які визнаються і в Україні, і за рубежом, це результат того, що міністр внутрішніх справ Арсен Аваков знаходиться на своїй посаді вже 6,5 років. І за ці роки він шляхом помилок та проб він підібрав ту команду, яка дозволяє стабільно реалізовувати плани по захисту внутрішньої безпеки в нашій країні. Можу сказати, що на сьогодні ситуація в цілому в країні є більш-менш керованою, але ми розуміємо, що якщо Путін захоче зробити якийсь наступ на нашу країну, от, наприклад, навесні та влітку цього року була інформація від американських аналітиків, європейських аналітиків, що Росія може розглянути наступ на південну частину України для того, щоб запустити воду в Крим. І я не впевнений, що західні країни, які вже в 2014 році закрили очі на пряму російську агресію, зможуть нам якось допомогти. Ніхто за нашу країну воювати не буде, крім нас самих. Ми це розуміємо. Але, будь ласка, допомагайте нам більше через дозвол експорту сучасної зброї, через ще більше навчання наших військових, через передачу досвіду територіальної оборони. Взагалі, моя особиста мрія – це щоб у нас, як в Ізраїлі, як в Фінляндії, як в Швейцарії, мільйони людей, і жінок, і чоловіків мали доступ до зброї, були треновані, були організовані в отряди і в рамках територіальної оборони могли захистити нашу Україну. А так, ще раз хочу сказати, що Україна має лише 29 років демократії, ми будемо захищати нашу країну, але не всі українці поділяють такі ідеї. Біля 30% вважають, що Росія не є державою-агресором. На жаль, це є слідство нашої слабкості і відсутності захисту з російської пропаганди. Дякую. Якщо будуть питання, готові відповісти.
Дякую. Thank you very much. I think you've pointed to some of these vulnerabilities that we also talk about in our study, in particularly media space, and how, information is the fuel for democracy, for people to be able to judge policies. And when you have so much toxic content that is being poured into the TV screens and social media, both by Russia-allied media channels, like you mentioned, but also of Ukrainian vested interests who are against reform, it makes it very complex situation. But just to give one number, trust to Russian media is one of the lowest out of all social institutions in Ukraine. It's -72. So Ukrainians do watch Russian media, mostly in the East, I think, but they don't trust so much these sources of information. But now I would like to switch to Ambassador Baiba Browder, who is joining us from Brussels, to perhaps give us an overview of your contribution as partner of Ukraine, because Ukraine, of course, needs to build its own deterrence, its own resilience, but also cooperation with partners. How do you see this cooperation evolving in the future, and perhaps NATO's view on security, a whole wild approach, societal approach to security? Ambassador Browder, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Chatham House, and especially to you, Orysia, for this invitation on such an important theme as building resilience in Ukraine. And it's good to be back, even though virtually, at the Chatham House and back in London to discuss this important topic with you. So NATO defines resilience as society's ability to resist and recover quickly from a major shock or a crisis. So it is an essential basis for credible deterrence and defense. Resilience in NATO's view is first and foremost a national responsibility. Each member country needs to be sufficiently robust and adaptable to support the entire system to recover from the crisis. And it's already in de facto in the alliance's DNA, because Article 3 of the Washington Treaty, and it complements the Article 5, provides the responsibility of allies to create the resilience in their societies. So de facto, for us, it will also be one of the most important decisions and preparation points for the probably next summit, whenever that comes. And we are discussing resilience, we are working on it, and we have developed certain guidelines around it, and we see that allies more and more understand that it's not only the military capabilities, but actually civilian ability to support the military's tasks that are important. So being resilient, again, the contemporary challenges means that allies have to maintain and protect critical civilian capabilities. And as I said, that's alongside in support of military capabilities. So for example, already the Warsaw Summit, Allied leaders decided to focus NATO's resilience on the full spectrum of threats. So allies continue developing individual and collective capacity to resist these forms of armed attacks and also hybrid threats. The several baselines that I mentioned, which are the sort of indicators and documents provided for the national government. So the allies agreed on 7 baseline requirements for national resilience, against which allies measure their level of preparedness. So they reflect the core functions of continuity of government, and especially, for example, during the pandemic, we saw how important those were. They deal with essential services such as health responses, such as communications, logistics, and currently also 5G is included, and foreign ownership of critical infrastructure and important private sector companies. In addition, I can say that we can only confront today's security challenges effectively if we strengthen both the civilian and military preparedness. So it means not only the work across the whole of government, really the whole of government, but actually also with the private sector and civil society. So that means not only the whole government approach, but also the whole society approach. And civil society in this respect plays a very important role. The ongoing pandemic and also we can say that in the future, that it demonstrates the direct impact on every citizen in our countries. And there are no borders, be it in the alliance or be it outside the alliance, every country has been impacted by that. It also demonstrates that every citizen is able to respond, and civil societies, individuals forms this part of societal response. And for example, I would, especially in my field, would like to underline the importance of clear and credible communications, public communications from the governments. And if we think how the communication is perceived by our citizens and how they access to transparent and timely and accurate information, that forms an important part of national resilience, both the government's capabilities, but also the society's ability to receive impartial information and process it. So NATO also in the future will, as I mentioned, will work on the strengthening resilience and whole society resilience. And as the Secretary General said in his recent speech, we and our defense cannot be strong if our societies are not strong. So we cannot take and think only just about the military side. It's a whole country, whole government, whole society approach. Now, on Ukraine in this context, the fact that Ukraine was able to recover from the vicious attack and that it has flourished and grown and successfully conducted a number of elections, be it nationally or locally in Ukraine, shows that Ukraine has everything in its potential to successfully develop also further and be even more resilient and be prosper, be safe, secure in all aspects. And NATO allies are committed in supporting Ukraine and its efforts to enhance and strengthen the resilience. There are, of course, a variety of platforms and mechanisms, as always, when we talk about the cooperation, there's, there has to be an sort of toolbox through which we cooperate. So there are trust funds, for example, alone we have contributed, NATO allies have contributed almost above 40 million euros, and it has strengthened the command and control of your forces in Ukraine, logistics, and also standardization so that we could work together in international operations. Since 2015, just think shortly after the Russian invasion, NATO has been supporting Ukraine in strategic communications capabilities building and countering hostile information attacks. And we have actually also learned from what Ukraine has been doing because, again, Ukraine was under attack. In the same way, the NATO-Ukraine platform on countering hybrid warfare focuses on increasing Ukraine's and NATO abilities to identify hybrid threats and build capacity of state institutions to counter these threats. And of course, as a major aim, it has to strengthen the resilience of Ukraine's national democratic institutions. So civil preparedness, critical infrastructure protection, strategic communications capability, protection of civilians, cyber defense, counterterrorism, in all these areas we work together between NATO and Ukraine. And we learned from each other and we strengthen Ukraine and make Ukraine part of a natural community of democratic European states. Furthermore, NATO assists the state emergency services of Ukraine. We also help in civil protection, humanitarian assistance, how that is provided within Ukraine. I also want to make an important point that while resilience debate very often focuses on various concepts and systems and slogans or sectoral preparedness and others, the human factor is the most important. Our societies have changed with the advance of emerging and digital technologies. Our information spaces have become much more dispersed. The proximity of threats, be it cyber or informational attacks, are much more present. So it's really building the state capacity and nurtures the trust of our citizens in state institutions, in our governments, but also in themselves to understand that they are strong, that our citizens are able to understand and resist external and internal challenges. And this applies both to NATO and Ukraine. So all these aspects we work together with Ukraine in the 2020 annual national program, and Ukraine's government has very clear priorities in that, and resilience is de facto, and strengthening it is de facto already in the very center of Ukraine's national security strategy. And as part of that, we saw also that human security is right front and the center of the national security strategy. So all the givens are right there. Ukraine is going the right way, and NATO, the same as the EU and all the other international friends, are there to help and assist. But as the Deputy Minister rightly said, it's really the national effort and the belief and trust in yourself that you can do it that is necessary. And as we think when we climb a mountain, if we just think that we are there to make the next step or just to get to the next stone, it's very difficult to think about reaching the top. If we keep in mind that we are there in the process to reach the top of the mountain, and that is our objective, it becomes easier to make it. So again, with national resilience and strengthening it will never be a sort of final destination. We cannot say that there is one country in the world that can say that it has achieved 100% resilience. No. But by focusing our minds, by focusing all the resources that are there nationally and internationally, we will be able to get to the best possible situation in Ukraine. And Ukraine has everything. It has a great country, it has great institutions. Of course, I mean, there is a lot to be done in strengthening the citizens' trust and the institutions themselves. It has great, proud people, and the most important, it has a big, big support from international community. So you will do it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think it's very important that you reminded us that resilience, it's like democracy. It's a protracted struggle. It's a process that has to have embedded certain types of decision-making, diversity, self-regulation and other things that have to work in concert together. Because something that countries in the, and Ukraine is the country of a post-totalitarian legacy suffers is the trauma of the past, which is, frankly speaking, still impacting a lot of low trust, for example, to central government. It comes from that legacy. But, as Thai Minister of Digital, Thai from Taiwan, I will bring, she said, if the citizens don't trust us, we will trust the citizens. And I think this is a very interesting paradigm. And hopefully Ukrainian authorities will design processes that will entrust the citizens with their best judgments. But thank you so much. I must say to our audience that Ambassador will have to leave early at 3 o'clock because of previous commitments. So she unfortunately will not be able to stay for the Q&A sessions, but we'll share a recording with you so that you can later see the discussion following your presentation, if there will be any reflection. So thank you so much for taking time.
Thank you so much, and I'm really sorry, but we have an unexpected high-level meeting at NATO's, which I have to attend. But
Absolutely.
I look forward reading the report and to join you in future discussions. But the main thing, I look forward to really working together with Ukraine to go to the next step and next level of its bright future.
Thank you so much. So now I would like to turn to Yuka from Helsinki. The center is not working directly in Ukraine, but it is engaging a lot of Ukrainian experts to better understand hybrid threats of today. So I would like to pass the floor to Yuka to give his view on resilience.
Thank you very much for inviting me to contribute. And I will do this with pleasure in return to what we have learned from our Ukrainian colleagues. We have had such speakers in our events like Deputy Minister Dmytro Solotukhin, Professor Alexander Sukodolia from National Institute for Strategic Studies. He always speaks about energy systems, and he has been the bestseller. I have brought him to Western Europe many times, and always in our feedback formulas, this was the best part of our events, because he really can explain a practical viewpoint as a good engineer, the situation in energy. Colonel Serhiy Verbitsky has also contributed a few times from Prime Minister's office and always been very helpful in arranging us these experts, whom we also have had from other parts of armed forces like Air Force, Border Guard, Navy, and also Anti-Fraud Agency, once when we tackled the financial issues. And well, the Finnish embassy here, the Ukrainian embassy in Helsinki has also been very helpful. So we always we ask some update to information, and this always happens in one day. I'm very happy of that, and it gives much more impetus to what we say. And I must say, it seems to be positive for Ukrainian colleagues to have this kind of contacts, which obviously also shows that you don't have so many contacts, and I will address this part later on. Well, the key findings have been that Ukraine now is a test bed, and this is what we have learned. Sector by sector, test bed for hybrid warfare, and usually this kind of things get tested somewhere and then used elsewhere also. We have to be wary of that. As other speakers, I would also say quite strongly and try to encourage, but the way Ukrainians have been dealing this issue is it has not been only doing badly. You have managed to, it could be much worse. You have managed to contain a very dangerous military crisis, and you have managed to maintain a democratic system and democratic processes. Obviously, you have some sort of economy still rolling there, and because you are there, and so it's worth keeping up what you have also. At the end, I would shed some light from my viewpoint concerning resilience, and now I must give a kind of a warning and self-warn apologies in advance of what I say, because actually I don't have a comprehensive view of the Ukrainian conflict and all sufferings your people have met, because I've been looking at sector by sector. So I may say something that sounds very stupid or irritating to Ukrainian audience, but well, in that case it happens, and I have apologized. Generally speaking, we have studied such sectors of like economy, energy, found your approaches in legal domain also interesting. There is a big issue around maritime connections, and also drones have been interesting, already being mentioned. First of the sectors to mention would be, of course, the economy as a sphere of influence. It was already mentioned, and in our studies, this is a corner part of hybrid influencing by an adversary, if they can have a huge economic foothold, and if they can be kind of ordered to obey by a government when need be. That's of course very utmostly dangerous, and this of course was something that was seen in Ukraine quite evident to all of you, so I don't need to speak more. But talking of hybrid influence, this needs to be observed further in Ukraine and in other countries too. A big sector here has been energy, and where we can see takeovers of important parts of the energy infrastructure, and also disturbances of the energy. You know more, having been living there, but first target is of course the grid, and well, the electricity grid, it's a big bunch of wire going around countries, and if you cut the wire, there is no electricity, and you can cut it physically or you can cut it by using cyber tools, which has been seen in Ukraine, in western parts of the country. There is the grid, then there is the power production, and as we have learned, a big part of the power production capability has been in the eastern Ukraine, and this has been unfortunate, and we have seen military force being used against power production also, so just breaking things by artillery fire, serious thing. Also, energy resources are of course important, and you know that you lost gas fields. We here elsewhere, we don't know the story even. So energy obviously is a vulnerability, but also I think it can be a catalyst for a conflict because it's so precious. From legal domain, we learned a lot, and this was about how to control this kind of a conflict. And it has been important that Ukraine has been following the pattern of rule of law. So based on law, you have authorized your authorities to do, and I don't know the exact situation right now, but obviously it was the conflict in eastern Ukraine was first tried to be tackled with as an anti-terrorist internal security issue, and then the lesson learned was this will not bring coordinated enough activity, so give the command to armed forces and do this legally. That's the right thing to do when you need to shoot a lot. And also there had been earlier in a very bad blurring messages by adversarial media, and we learned that also this was some parts of that were shut down. And let me confirm to you that also in the Finnish emergency legislation, we have a possibility to shut down radio stations, etc., if they are based on certain type of decision making. I would be very interested in revisit and update your experiences from the legal points of view again, because we did this legal approach already 2 years ago. So you must have a lot of interesting to tell to us again. And then another topic, we have seen drones really becoming a game changer in the battlefield. And this is really interesting because cheap drones, we have heard the story of Ukrainian self-made drones even, making a big difference. Because as we all understand, the drone doesn't need to be brave, but it can see on the other side and direct fire, etc. And somehow the drones are going to make the current heavy weapon systems obsolete also. Tanks, big artillery, etc. Thanks for the lessons. Now, the very interesting point and dangerous, which is not discussed so much internationally, is this imposition of a control regime over maritime traffic that you are facing in the Sea of Azov. And this can lead to the economic damage. We have pinpointed this with your support, and now it's such a long story, but it's a very important case. It is now in the International Tribune in Hague, and it's possible that unfortunately the Ukrainian hand here is a little bit weak because of historical reasons. Maybe the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea is not applicable in the Sea of Azov, but we will see. But you have other parts of coast to protect also, so be careful here. We have now developed some expertise here, collecting together professor level experts, and so we try to understand what might happen and how to live with there one needs to be very careful. Ukraine has so far stayed clear of facing an open international armed conflict with Russia. And this is, of course, very important. And as, to my surprise, I see some legal purists saying that this is exactly what you should do in order to have legal clarity, which shows how many different interpretations of we can have in even in academic spheres. There you need to be very careful. So resilience, looking towards the future also. The resilience can be technical. I would call another sphere is tactical. This means the methods and patterns, how you conduct everyday supply of livelihood, etc. And the third part would be moral. And I think you already, Ukrainian are maybe masters of all already because of this lengthy exercise. But I will address the moral part. This is a little bit old-fashioned word, but I think it works well, moral. So the moral needs to be emphasized. We have heard such urges today already. So you need to keep up an understanding why it's better to be a Ukrainian than something else. And this, of course, needs to include a vision of some sort of a prominent future, even after some losses. Maybe you cannot have everything you would like, but whatever may happen, and you need to have, beyond that, you need to have a prominent future for the people. And to keep up this moral, of course, requires fair standards. And of course, any alleged or true corruption is really bad in this sense, because it makes people indifferent. And we often talk about people, so let's be fair and let's not forget the government workers. They should be motivated to keep up moral, because if they get entirely tired, who wouldn't? And now this all moral side goes hand in hand with your external support, with which Ukraine will need a lot. And that's why Ukrainian administration and society should not become a scapegoat, because foreign states and foreign states citizens will only want to help the good guys, not the others. So it's a very important front. And it must be borne in mind that situations will keep changing in future. And nobody knows what will be the situation after a few years. So there is a seed of success always, because one never knows what happens to the adversary either. And what I heard about territorial defense from the minister here, it's absolutely a good idea. Territorial defense is such a deterrence which deters the adversary and does not give reason by claims of this is an offensive capability, so we need to negate it. So you need to maintain and improve, I say to Ukrainians, improve support in other countries. And one practical point is visibility in media. Well, it's almost every time I have some Ukrainian colleagues whom I talk with, they get surprised of what I don't know. And I try to monitor these things. For example, that gas fields west of Crimea were lost during this operation. Nobody here knows about that. And about the constant flow of casualties from the front, nobody knows it. It's not visible in our media. So this conflict is quite forgotten in Western media. And this could be, of course, a lesson that we should try to see that this thing is visible, more visible in Western media. But on the other hand, Western media cannot be dictated what to cover and how. If you try to do that, they get angry and they will write the opposite. And but at least we should monitor this visibility. And so the external support will be needed also to draw certain red lines, which I see some ahead can talk more in confidence, for example. And as heard, resilience is also, in this case, a durability issue. This is a long test. Like Ambassador Brace said, if you want to climb the mountain, you need to aim at the top, not the next step. So that would be my notes for this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jukka. I think you've touched upon very important function of human security and resilience, this sense of purpose and determination. You call it morale or perseverance. something that Ukraine is persevering, perhaps as Deputy Minister said, regardless of or despite being not maybe supported to the level that it believes it deserves facing such serious adversary. But now we have half an hour, and I really would like to open to the floor because we have around 60 participants right now. So there are two ways to engage. One is to type your question in the chat function. If you have a specific question to ask to a speaker, please do so, or you can raise your hand. But before we open to the floor, we have a quick poll to run just to replicate the similar survey that we did with the experts in Ukraine. So you can do it right now by choosing, do you think President Zelensky's policies are making Ukraine more resilient, more vulnerable, make no difference? You don't know, maybe you would like to have more information about it. But it's just to have your sense of where you see Ukraine stands right now. And of course, as Mr. Herashchenko said, the legacy comes way before Zelensky. Of course, he's been in the office for only a year and a half, but it's just to understand how you evaluate his performance. So I think we still have a couple of seconds left voting. It would be interesting to know your view, and we'll be happy to share with also Ukrainian authorities. Perhaps it's a perception problem. Perhaps there's not enough information in the media. We are doing as much as we can at Chatham House, and there's quite a big body of research on Ukraine that you can find online. But now that we have more than 50% voted, I think we could give 1 more seconds and then we can stop here. So you can see the sense is that Ukraine, is still more vulnerable to Russian aggression. And this is a good question, to perhaps some of these views will be expressed right now in the Q&A. So do raise your hand and also type your question in the chat. So far, I don't see any raised hands. I see some questions in the chat. So we will start with that and then we see if any participants. So one of the first questions here is from Alex Folks, who is a question to everybody, but perhaps we'll start with, we'll go to Mr. Herashchenko. Does the continuing level of corruption in Ukraine and stalling of the process of de-oligarchization in media and judicial reform help to explain the reticence of Western partners to provide more assistance than the Deputy Minister mentions? So, Mr. Herashchenko, do you think the perceptions that Ukraine still remains quite a corrupt country discourages Western allies to provide military aid and lethal weapons to Ukraine?
По-перше, я хочу знову повернутися до питання Будапештського меморандуму. Це документ, який був підписаний президентом Сполучених Штатів Біллом Клінтоном, президентом Франції Франсуа Мітераном і президентом Британії Джоном Мейджором. Так от, у цьому меморандумі там було сказано, що завдяки тому, що Україна передає 1740 ядерних боєголовок, кожна з яких могла би уничтожити Лондон чи Нью-Йорк, то Україна отримує гарантії безпеки. І там нічого не було про те, що буде в Україні через 10, 20 чи 30 років. Тому сказано, віддаєте ядерну зброю, отримуєте гарантії безпеки. Ні про корупцію, ні про що там не було. Але коли почалися проблеми, то Західний світ сказав, ой, перепрошуємо, але ми не будемо вас захищати, тому що Росія така сильна, в неї багато нафти, газу, тому інше. Тому, будь ласка, давайте не будемо сплутувати це питання. Є багато інших країн, які Захід підтримує, незважаючи на рівень корупції. Наприклад, є така країна Азербайджан. В неї, я думаю, що з корупцією не все гаразд. Але чомусь європейські країни, Сполучені Штати з Азербайджаном мають прекрасні відносини. Або арабські країни нафтогазові, в яких немає жодної демократії. Наприклад, Саудівська Аравія. Там немає демократії, в принципі, взагалі. Взагалі немає. Там людям відрубають голови і використовують, тортури. Але ж Саудівською Аравією все гаразд, їм поставляють будь-яку зброю, літаки, там, і все що завгодно. Тому давайте не будемо пов'язати це питання. Є питання наступне, що Російська Федерація має величезний лобійський апарат, який особливо ефективно працює у Германії, у Німеччині, у Італії. Загальновідомий факт, що колишній прем'єр-міністр Німеччини пан Шредер, це голова наглядової ради декількох крупніших державних компаній, що колишній тричі прем'єр-міністр Італії пан Сільвіо Берлусконі – це особистий друг Володимира Путіна. І це є факт. Є багато політиків, які в Європі підтримують. А ситуація з Угорщиною, коли пан Орбан відкрито підтримує Путіна, і Угорщина блокує будь-які резолюції, які націлені проти Російської Федерації, і має багато економічних відносин. Тому давайте не пов'язувати ці дві питання. Україна – це є форпост демократії у Східній Європі. Ми є, як в давнішні часи, заслоном на шляху Російської Федерації до Європейського Союзу. Тому нам потрібно допомагати будь-яким чином. Тому що якщо паде Україна і піде у зону російських інтересів, то за нею підуть і інші країни. А що буде робити Захід та НАТО, якщо зелені чоловічки, так звані, які висаджувалися у нас в Криму, почнуть висаджуватися у Литві та в Естонії? А російська влада буде казати, що там ці люди захищають інтереси російськомовного населення, яке угнітається там, наприклад, при Балтійських країнах. Що тоді робити? Тому що ми вже знаємо досвід, коли умиротворяли Гітлера, закінчилося з Другою світовою війною.
Okay, thank you for taking time. And I see, just to wrap up maybe on the corruption, because we have several comments from Taras Kuzio, who is saying that this is over-focus on corruption makes such Orientalist thinking, that there's corruption in Ukraine, which is facilitated by local actors and by Western European and North American facilitators with ability to money laundering. Please begin talking about corruption within the context of being a two-way process. I absolutely agree. And I think one of the pleas of also the Russian opposition in exile in many cases is that the best way to tackle Putin is also to go after, money that are being laundered out of Russia abroad. There was a certain momentum, I must say, after Panama Papers were released here in London. There was a big anti-corruption conference to go after, but unfortunately there was no follow-up. But it's a factor. It's one of those images that is being, of course, glued to Ukraine as being a corrupt country. That's why Ukraine has to, prove itself in a way. If there is a fight against corruption, there has to be more information about it. But we do see also a certain moves, especially within the prosecutor's office general and other agencies that are so far not delivering. And it's not just an opinion of Western experts, it's also opinion of Ukrainians, that they do not trust Ukrainian justice sector to protect their rights. So there's still quite a lot to be done on that front. I was asked by Konstantin Yeliseyev, who is in the room, who wanted to make a comment on video. Anya, could you please unmute Konstantin Yeliseyev, if he could make his comments? Yes, go ahead, Konstantin.
Yeah, thank you
Just
very much.
Just introduce yourself, please.
Yes, I'm Konstantin Yeliseyev, how to tell, now the chairperson or chairman of the NGO New Solution Center, and previously I was the diplomatic advisor to the President Poroshenko, and in the years 2010-2015 was ambassador of Ukraine to the European Union. So thank you very much indeed for giving me floor. I will try to be very brief. And again, thank you very much for this good opportunity to participate in the excellent conversation. First of all, let me fully agree with Deputy Minister Anton Gerashchenko, and just to reiterate once again that Ukraine currently is fighting Russian aggression, but we are also protecting the whole Europe and also the whole world from Russian neo-imperialistic policy. So that's why we need to work together in order to strengthen our mutual resilience to withstand Russian aggressive appetite. So that's why point number one, fully agree with previous speakers who clearly mentioned about some homework which needs to be done by Ukraine in order to reinforce its internal resilience to the Russian aggression. And here we know what needs to be done: fights against corruption, rule of law, judiciary, to stop politically motivated prosecution against the opponents, to increase and improve investment climate. So we are trying to do our best, and I have no doubt that we will succeed. But I would like just to refocus our attention to the external factor. In my view, we need to discuss what our partner could do in order to reinforce, to strengthen Ukraine's resilience to withstand Russian aggression. Of course, we could speak in theoretical terms, but I would prefer to speak in concrete terms. What our partners, in my view, could do to increase Ukraine's resilience. Number one, the international community, namely NATO, needs to give Ukraine membership action plan. Number two, the European Union finally must clearly give to Ukraine a clear-cut membership perspective in the European Union, and to increase gradual sectoral integration of Ukraine to a different sector of the EU policies and EU economies. Number three, the European Union and NATO must give a clear-cut green light to all its member states to provide Ukraine with the lethal weapons in order to increase defensive potential of Ukraine. Number four, we need to continue to conclude bilateral agreements between Ukraine and partner countries in security and defense areas, like recently was done during the visit of President Zelenskyy to London, and we welcome very much the decision of government of Great Britain to provide huge assistance to Ukraine in the area of defense, in particular in the maritime sphere. Number five, we need to increase our cooperation in cybersecurity, which is key areas, and Ukraine, by the way, at the epicenter of the cyber attack, mainly orchestrated by Russia. Just let me mention famous cyber attack Untitled Chapter, which was very dangerous for Ukraine's infrastructure.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You can show, because I have so many questions in the chat.
Number seven, we need to reinforce our cooperation in disinformation area. And in this regard, let me draw attention to the recent initiative by Ukraine to set up in Kyiv the International Center to fight disinformation. This is also very important. And last but not least, of course, my list is not exhaustive, but last but not the least, our partners must stop to play games with Russia, namely to stop some vicious, some dangerous projects, like, for example, Nord Stream 2, which is a Trojan horse for whole Europe and for the international democratic world. So let me stop on that. But again, this is concrete proposal, which in my view could increase Ukraine's resilience to withstand Russian aggression. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I think it's important to understand that this takes two to tango, of course. It's not just Ukraine, but we really wanted to focus this discussion about Ukraine, regardless of the West, what it could be doing. I think it's important you brought in this dimension. But here I want to connect a question to your last point, Konstantin, that you made about disinformation. And Marina Pesenti, who is running research on cultural policy for Chatham House, she is asking Anton Herashchenko, you spoke of 30% of Ukrainian population watching Russian television channels and the powerful media presence of pro-Russian oligarchs such as Viktor Medvedchuk. At the same time, Ukraine has been struggling to build its strong, powerful public broadcaster, Suspilne TV, which is chronically underfunded. Why is it proving so difficult? And do you think this will help to make Ukrainian information space, more nuanced, more neutral, more fact-based rather than fake-based? Пане Антоне, this is the question to you about Суспільне.
Я скажу, что, к сожалению, с 2014 года в Украине не было принято революционных мер по борьбе с российской пропагандой. Те меры, которые были приняты, они имели декоративный характер. Невозможно было бы победить гитлеровскую Германию, если бы в Великобритании свободно вещало немецкое радио на английском языке. Невозможно противодействовать пропаганде без жестких мер, которые связаны с невозможностью соблюдения так называемого права свободы слова для всех. В России нет свободы слова, там есть свобода вранья и свобода пропаганды. Поэтому у нас работают действительно каналы, которые финансируются за российский счет, и по ним не принимались меры воздействия ни во времена Петра Порошенко, ни сейчас. Это действительно большая проблема. И я думаю, что если она не будет решена в Украине, то постепенно пророссийские силы будут получать все больше и больше поддержки на выборах. Цифра 30% поддержки России, это я ее беру из социологических опросов, когда задается вопрос, считаете ли вы, что Россия является государством-агрессором или нет. Так вот, около 30% украинцев заявляют, что они не считают, что Россия есть государство-агрессор. Это есть вот результат 6,5-летней российской пропаганды о том, что это Украина сама виновата, что не надо было делать Майдан и так далее, и так далее. Вот такой результат. Поэтому борьба с российской пропагандой должна заключаться в том, что должен быть принят закон, в котором было бы сказано, что не может быть финансирования телевидения, любых других средств массовой информации, если нет доказательства того, что эти деньги не проходят со стороны государства-агрессора. Пока такой силы на принятие такого закона и консенсуса нет, к сожалению.
But the question was about funding for Ukrainian Suspilne TV, which is coming from the Ukrainian budget.
Относительно общественного телевидения. Значит, в бюджете Украины на этот год выделено, если не изменяет память, около 2 миллиардов гривен. Если это перевести в доллары, это порядка 80 миллионов долларов. Я могу сказать, что это соответствует финансированию крупнейших украинских телеканалов, которые имеют по 10-15% рейтинга, таких как 1+1, таких как телеканал Украины и так далее. И есть большой вопрос к эффективности менеджмента управления этими деньгами. Деньги выделяются на самом деле относительно размеров бюджета Украины огромные, но как-то вот они не превращаются в эффективное телевидение. При этом мы понимаем, что частным компаниям очень просто взять и построить. Например, Ренат Ахметов запустил за последний год новый телеканал «Украина-24». Он работает, набирает аудиторию. Суспильно финансируется уже, наверное, года 4 из бюджета. И при этом оно занимает стабильно последние строчки в рейтинге. Поэтому это есть вопрос качества управления. Пока мы не научились в Украине эффективно управлять государственным телевидением, в отличие от Англии, где есть BBC с ее историей.
Дякую. Thanks. I want to bring in my colleague Mathieu because there's the question from James Bergenson asking about that the report emphasizes the number of reform of the socio-political nature that the government could undertake. But what are the greatest constraints in making those reforms happen? Is this the question of funding? Is because Ukraine is poor? Is it political differences within the government? Is it COVID-19? So what is it that blocks Ukraine's effectiveness? Perhaps there's a vision, but the devil is in the implementation. What is it, Mathieu?
So I think it's all of the above and none of the above simultaneously, in the sense that, incidentally enough, Orisia and I were looking at, what the positive contributions and the negative contributions have been in terms of Ukrainian increased resilience, especially under President Zelenskyy. One of the main factors is basically what we could call the resistance from the old guard in Ukraine. The resurgence of pro-Russian elements and mouthpieces. I think Mr. Ferashenko has mentioned a few of them, but also a lot of issues linked specifically to the personality and the style of management of the Zelenskyy presidency. The lack of follow-up, for instance, on a lot of projects, or some incoherence, for instance, around COVID management or slow decision-making. A lot of inaction concerning specifically impunity for politicians or pressing concerns around LGBTQI+ in Ukraine, for instance, and poor strategic communications in a way. There is a lot of communication, but it is not targeted enough that it can actually permeate through society, or it is diluted because there is not enough audience time in a way for Zelenskyy and his team. And also the lack of civil society and state cooperation at the national level that is weak. So all in all, you have a lot of drawbacks, you have a lot of negative aspects, but I don't only want to amplify or over-amplify negative aspects, because there has been a lot of positive contributions from the Zelenskyy presidency. If you look at the framework for transitional justice, for instance, that is completely new, or the new national security strategy that does mention resilience for the first time. Yes, there is no, it is only an intention, and there are no concrete steps at building this specific resilience and trying to understand how much more resilient the country can become in terms of scoring, but at least there is a lot of positive things going forward, or an increased consideration, as I was mentioning, around this people-based or human-based approach to conflict settlements. So a few more steps have been designed in a very positive way. It still, of course, needs to go forward, but at least there is renewed impetus for a lot of positive action that go just beyond the framework of reform, or just beyond economic stabilization, or all the requirements from the IMF, for instance. So it's going on the right track and on the right direction, but it does take time, of course. And this is also the problem, is that time is playing against Ukraine in many ways, whether it is economic stabilization, whether it is the conflict, but also this sense of sort of Ukraine fatigue that is increased in the international community that is really hard to fight.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to bring in Yuka now, because there's a question from Yulia Drobesh that is asking on the EU side. There has been, in her assessment, some EU's inability to effectively respond to the conflict in Ukraine. And she's asking, does this indicate of the lack of EU's own defense and security capacity, or the lack of coherent, united member states consensus towards, effective strategy in helping with this conflict, or perhaps overall vision for the region? Like we've heard Mr. Yeliseyev saying, Ukraine needs membership perspective. It needs to be treated as an equal member of the European family. How do you see something impeding EU's assistance from within?
Thank you for the very delicate question. But EU is such a family that it takes a long time to understand its nature. And it's absolutely not a military organization, or it's not a business entity either, where there would be a chain of command to a place where one can really take decisions. And the EU has not, it was not primarily made in order to wage war at all. So it's that's why the testing of EU fledging its military muscle has not been seen anywhere yet. But let's keep in mind that the EU has been solid in sanctions against Russia since the occupation of Crimea. And well, some say they have no effect, but of course they have a lot of effect. Let's see, if we could see what the situation was without the sanctions, it would be something very different. So don't wait for the EU troops to arrive in Ukraine. Just forget about that. And then I come back to my earlier statements. You need to look like Western democracy. And there will be more and more support to the idea of politically supporting Ukraine with this outset. That's how it is.
Thank you very much. I mean, I think it's realistic, and only friends give honest answers. So thank you very much. We appreciate that sobering reminder that, of course, and then frankly, in Ukraine, Ukrainians are not expecting neither European or American troops on the ground. If you look at what Ukrainians are expecting actually from the European Union, it's more pressure on also Ukrainian leadership to deliver reform, because you have a certain incoherence among the capacity to deliver at the national level, at the local level, with the people expectations. So Ukrainians are expecting that EU will remain interested and engaged and also will provide, like it did, much needed microfinancial assistance. But that we can discuss at maybe another event specifically. But I want to bring the last question because we're almost running out of time, something that Anton Herashchenko mentioned in his introductory remarks, and we mentioned in our study, the role of the church, because Mr. Herashchenko, you mentioned that there are certain divisions among those who unite more around Russian Orthodox Church, those who are identifying more with Ukrainian Orthodox Church. So there's a question from Denis Kolesnyuk, who is asking, how important is this? And does Ukraine have a strategy to offset a negative influence of a Russian Orthodox Church?
Ну, давайте скажемо так. Питання впливу Російської Федерації через церкву, воно не нове. Загальновідомий факт, що Московський патріархат разом з Газпромом – це є така собі гібридна зброя Російської Федерації. Газпром використовує для тиску енергетичного, а Московський патріархат використовує для промивання мізків. Буду відвертий, що Петро Порошенко, як президент України, він багато зробив для того, щоб зробити альтернативу Московському патріархату. Під його політичним тиском, дипломатії постала Православна Церква України, як церква, яка керується саме з Києва. І митрополит Єпіфаній, беззаперечно, є українським патріотом. Міністерство внутрішніх справ і держава Україна, ми, як за Конституцією, відділені від церкви, але зрозуміло, що ми підтримуємо морально українську церкву і вважаємо, що це є добре. Тому певні кроки в цьому напрямку зроблені, але Росія підтримує економічно через своїх людей в Україні на десятки мільйонів доларів Московський патріархат і використовує під час виборів. Можете не сумніватися, що під той час, коли ми зараз проводимо нашу конференцію в Chatham House, десь в тисячах містечок України, значить, представники Московського патріархату агітують за тих чи інших кандидатів на мери місць і депутатів міських рад, які будуть йти у кільватері російської політики. Тобто це використовується як гібридна зброя.
Well, I think religious rights, similar to freedom of speech, it's a very fine line to walk, and I think it's been quite telling that Yuka mentioned that it's so important that Ukraine abides to the democratic principles of building its society, at the same time protects its national security. And this is something that is a very fine balance to achieve. But because we have a few more minutes, I see the question from Volodymyr Lupati that is directed to Yuka. What, from your perception, when you look at vulnerabilities of society, is the role of national identity in national resilience? How important is it? And you know, in the modern sense of identity, it's such a complicated phenomena. But how do you see it? And perhaps you have some advice for Ukraine, how you see Ukrainian national identity policies going.
Well, I'm a Finn, and we have a very clear issue about this national identity, and but we are bilingual, so you have full citizen rights also here by being born in a Swedish-speaking family. And besides, they are in average more rich than the rest, and they live 10 years longer. But I think we cannot forget this kind of issues nowadays as a national identity. But the modern version, of course, is to be quite tolerant, to have, but you need to be member of this family and this nation. And then this is your nation. And maybe it's not wise to pose very strict questions about that. But as I have understood from Ukrainian colleagues, for example, there are many Ukrainian whose native language has been Russian, but who absolutely want to be Ukrainian. So, of course, there is an issue where most likely in Ukraine you need to embrace Russian speakers and Ukrainian speakers together because both live in Kyiv and were born in Kyiv. So what else to do? But my answer is yes. Nationalism is something, it's like a curse word nowadays, but it depends on how you define it. But I think every sound person has, well, not the richest ones who travel all around the globe, but otherwise a normal sound person who is the cornerstone of a sound society needs to have a national identity. And so thus it needs to be supported.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we will be concluding now, and I would like to first, before we close the meeting, share these polling results, because I'm not sure you have seen them. So these are the results, and the majority of you kind of thinks that it's more vulnerable to Russian aggression, but many believe it makes no difference, and Ukraine, you know, carries on from the Poroshenko era, the similar approaches. So we will be watching the space very carefully. We do hope at Chatham House to continue our work on resilience, because, you know, frankly speaking, Russia is one source of threat, but there's also, you know, now global pandemics. Ukraine also faces many environmental turbulences, as we have seen with floodings in the east. So the complexity and uncertainty will accompany us for a while, regardless of where we all live. And we as individuals and the states need to learn this resilience. Some of us are better at it, some of us are still struggling. So I would like to thank all the contributors to today's discussion, of sharing your insights. And let's keep this community of resilience going, exchange ideas. And I think we have, yeah, if you can mute yourself. So I would like to thank you all. Our study is available online. If you have any comments, do contact us directly, me and Mathieu. Or if you have anything to other speakers or any feedback from today's event, do let us know. Thank you so much for joining in such numbers. We'll share the video of this discussion, so it will be available. Thank you very much. All, you have a good day and stay well and stay healthy. Thank you so much for joining us.